Okay, this is 2018 problem 5. The average rate of change of f is over this interval is simply another way of saying find the slope when x is 0 and x is pi. So when we do that, we're going to get that the average rate of change is going to equal, and I'm going to plug pi in first, so that's going to be e to the pi cosine of pi minus e to the 0 cosine of 0 all over pi minus 0. And that should be enough to get you full credit. But if I go ahead and do this, e to the 0 is 1, cosine to the 0 is 1. So this is going to be -1 over here on the left, and then cosine of pi is -1. So that'd be negative e to the pi all over pi. If you simplified it, that'd be your answer for part A. Part B, what is the slope of the tangent line? So the slope of the tangent line means we have to get the derivative of f. So we got to do product rule. So f prime of x is going to be the first term times the derivative of the second term, which is negative sign. So I'm going to stick the negative there, plus the second term, which is cosine, times the derivative of the first term, which the derivative of e to the x is e to the x. So there's my derivative. So now I need to plug in 3 pi over 2. So we get 3 pi over 2 would plug into that x. 3 pi over 2 would plug into that x. And 3 pi over 2 would plug into that x. And 3 pi over 2 into that x. And 3 pi over 2 into that x. Now, that's supposed to be good enough, but if we simplify that all the way down, 3 pi over 2, I hope we all know, is 270 degrees. So the sine of 270 is -1. So -1 times a negative e to the 3 pi over 2 is e to the 3 pi over 2. And then the cosine of 3 pi over 2, that part right there is 0. So this whole thing goes away. So that would be e to the 3 pi over 2. Now, because we're going to use that down here later, I'm going to leave that derivative up there. I'm going to undo all this other stuff so we can see the derivative later. Okay. So we're going to come down here, find the absolute minimum value from 0 to 2 pi, justify your answer. So when we see absolute value right here, we're going to want to think that we're going to make a t-chart. So I'm going to go ahead and make a t-chart down here. And I'm going to plug in x values, and I'm going to find f of x values. And we're going to want to use the endpoints and the critical numbers. So 0 is one endpoint, and 2 pi is another endpoint because of this thing right here where it tells me 0 to 2 pi. And then we want to find our critical numbers by taking the derivative up here that we just found a minute ago and setting it equal to 0. So I'm going to factor out my greatest common factor of e to the x here, and that's going to leave me cosine x minus sine x. And then I want that to equal 0. Well, I hope you remember that e to the x is never 0, so I get nothing out of that. And so I want to know where cosine x minus sine x equals 0. So that's going to be wherever cosine x equals sine x. So if I think about the unit circle, that's going to be true on the unit circle at 45 degrees and down here at 225. So at 45 degrees, that's pi over 4. And down here at 225, that is 5 pi over 4. If you change, you need radians. So there's our critical number. So we're going to put pi over 4 in here. And we're going to put 5 pi over 4 down here. So there's the numbers I've got to plug in to my original function up here. So e to the 0, cosine to the 0. E to the 0 is 1, cosine to the 0 is 1. 1 times 1 is 1. Pi over 4. So cosine at 45 degrees, I hope we all know, is radical 2 over 2 or 1 over radical 2 over 2. And this would be e to the pi 4th. And then the next problem, 5 pi over 4, the cosine is negative this value, so this is negative radical 2 over 2. And this is e to the 5 pi over 4. And then 2 pi, when you do e to 2 pi, that's the same as e to 0. And cosine to 2 pi is the same as e to 0. No, it is not either. E to the 0, it's e to the 2 pi, my bad, e to the 2 pi. And then cosine of 2 pi and 0 are both here, so that's 1. So that would be your answer. So we are supposed to tell from that what the absolute minimum is. Well, the only negative answer would be the minimum. So the minimum answer on this is going to be this one because it is the only negative answer. So we would say the absolute min is equal to, oops, the wrong button. The absolute min is equal to that negative radical 2 over 2 cosine of 5 pi over 4 at x equals 5 pi over 4. And again, the reason is my t-chart. Going on to the last one, part D, and I'm going to erase some of these. Part D says let g be the differentiable function g of pi over 2 equals 0. And the graph of g prime, the derivative of g, is shown down here below. So this thing right here is the g prime graph. Find the value of the limit of pi over 2 of f of x and g of x. So I'm going to first of all plug that into the two functions. So I'm going to do pi over 2 first for f. So f of pi over 2 is going to equal, so going up there to the original problem, that's going to be e to the pi over 2, sorry, e to the pi over 2. I'm using the original function here. And then cosine pi over 2. Well, I hope you all know the cosine of pi over 2 is 0. So my numerator is 0. And then when I do g as x approaches pi over 2, I'm given that right here in the problem, that is 0. So because that is 0 over 0, we can fix this one. So what we're going to do is we're going to do L'Hopital. So L'Hopital's rule says that if you get a top and bottom that's 0 over 0 or infinity over infinity, we can do the derivative. So what that means is we have to say by L'Hopital that this also equals, and you might want to write that down and say that this thing up here equals that, equals the limit as x approaches pi over 2 for the derivative of f of x. You do each derivative individually. It's a no quotient rule. And g prime of f of x. So we come up here, and that's the whole reason that I saved this thing the whole time, is because I knew I was going to have to use that again on this because I did these ahead of time. And now I'm going to plug in pi over 2 up here. So when I plug in pi over 2 up here, I get negative e to the pi over 2 power. And then the sine of pi over 2 is 1 because it's at the top of the circle. The cosine of pi over 2 is 0, so that's 0. So right there is my cosine. I'm sorry, my derivative. So my top number is negative e to the pi over 2 power. And then g prime, this is the graph of g prime. So g prime at pi over 2 is right here. So the limit from the left goes to there, and the limit from the right goes to there. So that puts a 2 in the bottom, and that right there is the answer, negative e to the pi over 2 over 2.